Breaking news on FNN. The United Nations has officially recognized the transatlantic slave trade as one of the gravest crimes against humanity. The resolution passed overwhelmingly, with just 3 countries voting against. Nothing many didn't expect, but still, today marks a powerful moment in history. A step toward acknowledgement, accountability, and perhaps the beginning of reparations. A great day for truth and for justice.
In a dramatic split from the global consensus, the United States, Israel, and Argentina cast the only 3 votes against a landmark UN resolution declaring the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity, a move that sent shockwaves through the General Assembly and ignited fierce international debate. The resolution, adopted by an overwhelming 123-3 vote, was celebrated across much of Africa and the Caribbean as a long overdue acknowledgement of slavery's enduring legacy and a step toward reparative justice. Yet the oppositional trio that included the United States, Israel, and Argentina argued that the measure risked rewriting legal history and creating a hierarchy of human suffering, with those benefiting from the slave trade at the top of the hierarchy for committing and benefiting from the gravest suffering. U.S. officials insisted that while slavery was morally abhorrent, it was not illegal under international law at that time, and thus could not serve as grounds for retroactive reparations. Israel and Argentina aligned with similar concerns, placing themselves in stark opposition to the majority of the world's nations. Take a listen.
On this beautiful day in March, we're called to stand on the right side of history. Let it be recorded that when history beckoned, we did what was right, for the memory of the millions who suffered the indignity of the slave trade and those who continue to suffer racial discrimination. Let our vote on this resolution restore their dignity and humanity.
In favor, 123, against 3, abstentions 52. Therefore, draft resolution A/80/L48 is adopted.
We will never forget the victims of slavery. And we must never forget the malevolent system that sustained it for so long.
The world was asked a simple question. If the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans was one of the most brutal systems ever built by human hands, if it ripped more than 12.5 million Africans from their homes, if it turned black life into cargo, labor, property, and profit for centuries, then what should the world call it now? On March 25, 2026, the United Nations General Assembly answered. It called the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. And it called for reparatory justice. That should have been one of the easiest moral votes in modern diplomatic history. But it was not. The resolution passed by 123 votes to 3, with 52 abstentions. And the 3 countries that voted no were the United States, Israel, and Argentina. The UK and all EU member states abstained. That result tells us something bigger than the fate of one resolution. It tells us that when history points toward memory, the powerful are comfortable. But when history points toward repair, restitution, and accountability, the room changes. The language gets cautious. The principles get complicated. The law becomes selective. And suddenly the world is told that justice must wait. Let us be clear about what the resolution actually did. It did not just remember slavery as a tragedy. It called for formal apologies, restitution, compensation, institutional reform, and the return of stolen cultural artifacts without cost. It was Ghana's way of saying, the world cannot keep treating slavery as a closed moral chapter when its economic, racial, and political consequences are still alive in the present. And that is why the resistance mattered. Because the real line dividing the world was not between those who know slavery was evil and those who do not. The line was between those willing to acknowledge the crime in moral language and those willing to follow that acknowledgement toward material consequences. That is where the United States revealed itself most clearly. Washington's official explanation was dressed in legal language. It said the wording created a hierarchy of atrocities. It said reparations could not be grounded in retroactive legal responsibility. It said slavery was wrong, but this was not the right legal instrument. That is the formal argument. But beneath it sits a much uglier truth. The United States was not being asked only to remember slavery. It was being asked to stand in a world forum and admit that a system foundational to its own rise may still carry obligations in the present. And that, it would not do. This is the same United States whose own constitution still contains the 13th Amendment exception allowing involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime. That means the state now lecturing the world on law and moral hierarchy still carries a constitutional scar from slavery inside its own founding framework. Yet this same power voted no. That is not just legal caution. That is historical self-protection. Because once the transatlantic slave trade is not merely acknowledged, but politically elevated as the gravest crime against humanity, the questions get dangerous. What built Wall Street? What financed industrialization? What underwrote plantations, ports, banks, insurers, and empires? What created the racial order modern America inherited and still refuses to fully dismantle? That is the fear behind the no vote. Not memory. Not history. But consequence. Argentina's no vote tells a different, but related, story. Argentina also has a real slavery history, even if global discussions often erase it. Slavery existed in the territory that became Argentina for centuries. It was often urban as well as rural, especially in Buenos Aires, where enslaved Africans and their descendants once formed a major part of the population. Argentina's first constitution abolished slavery in 1853, though the process was gradual and continued longer in Buenos Aires after the province rejected the constitution. Scholars of Argentine slavery note that emancipation was slow, uneven, and deeply entangled with property rights, military service, and elite control. So Argentina was not voting from innocence. It was voting from amnesia, alignment, or both. And under Javier Milei, that alignment is not hard to read. Milei has drawn Argentina sharply closer to both Trump's Washington and Netanyahu's Israel, turning foreign policy into an ideological project of Western right-wing identification. So when Argentina stood with the United States against the resolution, it did not simply cast a legal vote. It placed itself inside a block of powers still more afraid of reparatory justice than moved by the enormity of the crime being named. Then there is Israel. Israel's vote does not carry the same direct historical meaning as the American and Argentine votes in relation to the transatlantic slave trade. But politically, it still matters. Israel joined the United States and Argentina in saying no, turning what might have remained a morally isolated US position into a small but symbolically powerful bloc. And that is what geopolitics does. It takes a question of historical justice and folds it into present alliance structures. The result is not truth, but alignment. And then we come to the abstainers. Because sometimes the most revealing vote is not no. It is maybe. It is not now. It is we understand the suffering, but. The UK and all EU member states abstained. They did not say slavery was acceptable. They did not deny its brutality. But when the language moved toward reparatory justice, they stepped back. Their argument, like Washington's, leaned on concerns about creating a hierarchy of atrocities or reading modern legal responsibility backward into history. But let's call that what it is? Abstention, in this case, was the polite language of refusal. It was complicity in softer clothing. Because when a world body is asked not merely to condemn a crime, but to recognize that its consequences require repair, neutrality is not neutral anymore. To abstain is to say, yes, this was monstrous, but do not ask us what follows. And that is exactly the political function abstention served. It shielded the old powers from the moral clarity of a yes vote without forcing them to absorb the public ugliness of an outright no. That is why this vote exposed so much. The African bloc and CARICOM pushed the resolution not just as remembrance, but as a justice claim. Ghana, CARICOM, and reparations advocates wanted the world to stop treating slavery as a museum exhibit and start confronting it as a structure whose afterlife is still visible in poverty, underdevelopment, racial hierarchy, debt, and dispossession. The powerful West responded with discomfort. Not because it does not know slavery was evil, but because it knows that once you accept the moral logic of repair, the conversation stops being symbolic. Then the questions become material. What is owed? Who owes it? How long can wealth built through coerced labor hide behind the argument that the law arrived too late? And this is where the resolution means the most, and where its limits become undeniable. Because the resolution does not deliver justice by itself. It is not legally binding. The UN General Assembly is the broadest political chamber in the world, but it is not a sovereign world court. UN resolutions generally do not bind member states the way domestic laws or Security Council measures sometimes can. And even the International Court of Justice depends in contentious cases on state consent. That means there is no single sovereign global justice system capable of forcing powerful states to obey history. And that is the bitter truth this vote reveals. The world can name the crime. The world can recognize the demand. The world can expose the morally bankrupt positions of those who voted no and those who hid behind abstention. But the world, as presently constituted, still lacks a just, fair, and sovereign mechanism to enforce repair on those with power enough to resist it. That is not a small detail. That is the architecture of global injustice itself. So what is the essence of the vote if it cannot deliver justice? Its essence is this. It changes the status of the claim. Before this, reparations could be treated by powerful states as activism, grievance, or moral rhetoric. After this, the UN General Assembly has elevated reparatory justice for transatlantic slavery into the recognized language of international politics. That does not compel payment. But it changes legitimacy. It gives Africa and the Caribbean stronger ground. It gives historians, lawyers, governments, and movements a wider platform. It makes dismissal harder. It makes evasion costlier. And it places a permanent political stain on those who opposed or diluted the resolution. This is how justice often begins in the international system. Not with immediate enforcement, but with recognition. Then legitimacy. Then pressure. Then coalition. Then negotiation. Then, sometimes, material outcome. The tragedy is that the process is so long because the system was never built for equal justice. It was built by empires, by victors, by states who wanted order without surrendering sovereignty to the people they harmed. So when people ask, if the UN General Assembly cannot deliver justice, where can justice be delivered? The honest answer is painful. Justice, in this world, rarely arrives from one institution. It has to be forced through many arenas at once. Through diplomacy. Through public memory. Through domestic courts where possible. Through artifact returns. Through apologies. through development settlements, through political pressure, through reputational isolation, through moral language hardening slowly into expectation. That is unsatisfying. But it is real. And it is precisely why this vote matters. Because the vote does not complete justice. It exposes the void where justice should be. It tells the world, here is the crime, here are the people still afraid of naming its consequences, and here is the system that can recognize truth but still cannot compel the powerful to repair it. That is not failure alone. It is revelation. The United States voted no because it fears consequence. Argentina voted no because it aligned itself with power and preferred the comfort of that alignment to the burden of history. Israel voted no because present geopolitical loyalty outweighed moral courage. And the abstainers, Europe, Britain, the others, revealed that they will mourn the dead of slavery, but hesitate when memory demands payment. That is the map the vote drew. Yet, for all its limits, something real happened. The world named the crime more clearly than before. It placed reparatory justice inside official multilateral language. It strengthened the African and Caribbean position. And it exposed the political cowardice of those who still prefer historical acknowledgement without historical accountability. So no, justice has not been done. But justice has been made harder to deny. And in a world with no sovereign, fair, enforceable system above power, that is often where the struggle has to begin. This is Liberation Lens. We do not just ask what the world recognizes. We ask who still gets protected when the truth is finally spoken aloud. If this analysis spoke to you, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share this video. Because silence protects power. And truth only moves when people choose to carry it. Stay alert. Stay critical. Perspective matters.